The last of the 7 goals is manageable government debt and deficit. So a quick recap, can you name the 7 goals? So we have improved standard of living, full employment, economic growth, stable prices, we have an equitable distribution of income, a balance of trade, and lastly the manageable government debt and deficit. So as we look at government debt and deficit, we need to know what it is. So debt is accumulated deficits. So what are a deficit? A deficit is where the government spends. So we have a deficit if government spending is more than they're bringing in tax revenue. Government surplus then would be where the government spends less than they bring in tax revenue. So if you have a deficit year after year, it becomes debt. And so we're looking at, is the amount of deficit and debt within a country manageable? How are we balancing the spending and taxation? Well, we can actually look at what's been happening in Canada in terms of our deficits or surpluses by our government. So there's a link on Blackboard to this article, but it will show you when we have deficits and surpluses. And so when the graph goes below the 0 line, then you're seeing deficits, and when they're above, there's surpluses. The interesting thing that you see here is you can actually see by political party who was in charge when that deficit or surplus occurred. Now, you can't, of course, blame a single political party for a surplus or deficit because it's possible that they inherited an economic growth period of time when the economy is booming, people have jobs, so they're paying more in taxes because they have more income. Or maybe they inherited a recession where the unemployment rate is high, so people aren't making income, they're not paying a lot into taxes. So it's possible that it's related to the political party and their policies, but it's also possible that it is economic conditions that they've inherited. But check out that article on Blackboard. So let's go back to our slides here. And let's look at where we stand currently and where we've been in terms of our debt and deficits. So you can see here historically, we in the 90s or in the 80s, we spent more than we brought in tax revenue. Then into the 2000s, we emphasized balancing the budget and started to have some government surpluses, so spending less than we're bringing in tax revenue. You can see for 2016 here on the right, there is an estimate this year, or for the 16-17 year, that we will have a budget deficit of about $29 billion here in Canada. In 2016, that deficit was about 2.5% of GDP, of the total value of what we produce. You can see other countries also are running deficits, UK, China, Japan. Very few countries run budget surpluses. Iceland has the greatest budget surplus in 2016. Germany, New Zealand, some of those countries as well had budget surpluses. Countries that are in economic turmoil, Afghanistan, Venezuela, have huge budget deficits. They're not bringing in tax revenue, and the government is spending. You can check out the videos about Venezuela on Blackboard. So deficits, when we don't pay them off, accumulate and become debt. Now before we look at debt though, there's one interesting thing to point out here, and that is if you want to join the European Union, there is actually a restriction to join the European Union. So if you want to join the EU, then your deficit can't be greater than 3% of GDP. Okay. Well, here you can see Canada, we have -2.5, UK -3.8. Interestingly, in 2007, the average deficit in terms of government spending versus taxes, the average deficit was 6.8%. So in 2007, not a single member of the European Union who was in the European Union already would have been eligible to join the European Union. So because they are a joint group of countries that share their economy, then they're trying to limit deficit spending by any particular country to have a deficit less than 3%. Now, deficits accumulate, become debt, and if we look at that same restriction for the European Union, if you want to join the European Union, your debt can't be greater than 90%. So if you want to join the EU, your debt can't be more than 90% of your gross domestic product. And in 2007, 2008, every country in the European Union exceeded that 90% of GDP. And you can see here in the orange colors all the countries that have more than 80% of their GDP, the amount of debt. So if we look at Canada in terms of Canada's debt at in terms of all of our combined municipal, federal, and provincial governments, our debt is about 91.5% of the total value of what we make. In the US, it's about 104%. So countries have been accumulating more and more debt because every year the government spends more than it brings in tax revenue. Now, is this a problem? Well, that depends. Is your debt structural or is it cyclical? So structural debt is where the government spends more than it brings in tax revenue, and it does it every year, even in the good times. This type of debt is problematic because it's only going to balloon further and further. Cyclical debt, in comparison, is when the government spends more than they bring in tax revenue, but that's when the economy is not doing well. If, when the economy is doing well, the government then spends less than they bring in tax revenue, and they pay off the debt in the good times, then the debt is cyclical. It's temporary, and that's not as bad for the economy. A government can accumulate debt for a couple of years without a huge negative impact. It's the structural debt that can have a big impact on your economy. And we'll look later this semester at what impact having too much debt can have on your country. Check out on Blackboard. You can see the debt clocks for Canada and the US, and you can see how much countries owe and what your portion would be if it was divvied up.